I'm currently working on a short animation about the science of CO2, and while working on that I've been developing a tutorial on full character rigging animation using After Effects and a number of really handy plugins, FreeForm Pro for one and Duik tools. And while doing this I realized that in After Effects there is a light version of FreeForm available, which is still quite powerful. And just after a few minutes of using it, I realized that a lot of the techniques I was using on the previous head rotations video were obsolete because they needn't be so complex. This plugin really changes the way that you can approach a basic character head and make a much more dynamic and intuitive interface. So I just did this quick little head here, and I just wanted to show you how the head works and give you a little video on how to do it. You could obviously do more elaborate heads using this, but this is just a really quick overview. So the way this guy currently works is I've built a little controller here, and this controller controls the interest where the character's looking. So not only does it control his eyes, but it also controls his head. This isn't a very sophisticated character, and I wanted his head to move with his eyes. I didn't want to have to rotate his head exclusively because he really doesn't have much of a body. He's just a CO2 molecule. But as you can see, it's nice to be able to control a head and just move it around. If you've seen any of the other videos I've done, you know I like to work with controllers and null objects that drive my characters. I find it keeps things cleaner and it's easier to work with. So I've got a number of different sliders here. I have interest, distance, blink, blink left, blink right, head X and head Y rotation. Head X and head Y are manipulatable on their own. So let's say I'm going to try to stuff everything here in one screen. So I can individually animate the X rotation of this character, and I can also individually animate the Y rotation of this character. There we go. I can keyframe that if I want to. And I can also individually do his blink left and blink right. So I can give each eye a different value so that I can have individual blinks, or I can set those to 0 and blink the two together. I also have this thing called interest distance, and this is to go wall-eyed or cross-eyed. So that's just to bring the eyes together. What I've done in the head X and head Y rotation is I've actually just attached a little bit of code here. The code is exactly the same for each one, it's just slightly modified. This code is just watching for the difference in the position of this null object here and adding that difference to the rotation value. So the original position of this null object was 1000 and 1000 because I made this composition here 2000 by 2000. I like to keep these kind of compositions as symmetrical as possible. It just helps keep the code simpler and the math simpler, so I can break things down without having to do a bunch of extra thinking. In this particular piece of code, it's checking to see where the Y position of this null object is at any given time. And then it says where the original Y position is, and then it calculates the difference by taking its current position and subtracting the original. And so it's essentially adding that difference divided by 70 into the rotation value on the Y-axis, which is back and forth right here. And the other thing I've done is I've actually put a value at time variable in there because I want the head to rotate a little bit behind the pupils because your pupils typically lead your head movements, and I might even increase that value because I do find the head is maybe keeping a little bit too closely up to the pupils. Now this is an interesting thing that I ran into, and I couldn't find any instruction on it or any example of it in the After Effects help files. Is if you're going to do a value at time on a position, on a two-dimensional position value, so you might just want the X to the Y axis like I have here. This here is the array that represents whether it's X, Y, or Z. If it were X, this number would be 0. If it was Y, it'd be 1. You have to put it in after the time value at time variable. As this guy moves around, the head rotates. At the same time, and I get into this a little bit in the actual tutorials, at the same time, the pupil's actually just following. Again, with this code I've used many times before, and it's just something you should copy and read and get to understand. It takes a little bit of time and playing with to get it, but essentially what it's saying is, again, the interest original position, it's talking about it's talking about that little green controller right here, saying that the original position was 1,000 and 1,000, and it's grabbing the position of the eye interest, which is that green box right there. This is eye interest, and it's just grabbing the position value of that eye interest, and it's just adding the difference of this eye interest to the pupil position, and with a little bit of math to smooth it out. So just copy this math and play with the numbers, and you'll get what you're looking for. The other thing is I have a little scalar value here, and that's just so I can scale the pupil size up and down using the slider here, or using the interest controller here. Okay, so I have pupil left and right size, and I can slide those sizes up and down. I just like to do that if the character is supposed to look particularly crazy. If I want to shrink the pupils, I can scale them. I did a left and right on this character because he's a little bit nuts, and there's a really strong likelihood he's going to have one pupil bigger than the other at times. Okay, so I'm going to show you how this is made, and you can apply these techniques to pretty much any character head you want and elaborate on them further. So I didn't record the audio while I went through this because I just want to scrub through it as quick as possible and skip over any steps that aren't entirely necessary. It's sort of an involved process, and there's a little bit of repetition that you don't need to really see. And I did go back and forth on a couple of things, experimenting to get it right. No two characters are ever really the same, and there's not always one way to solve a problem. So I often find that I have to experiment a little bit while I make them. You can see here I just imported the PSD file that I made for this character. The two nested eye compositions that you can see were actually folder layers in Photoshop. Whenever you import a Photoshop file with folders in it, it actually treats those as nested compositions. So I have the molecule body on the bottom here, and then the two eyes. And inside each eye are all the blinking layers, so the eyelids, and the pupil, and the little light glint on the eyes, and then the actual base of the eye itself. So I'm just taking a look at all of them, making sure everything's there. And first thing I'm going to do is actually resize the composition. I changed the length of it. Now I just want to change the size of it. It may not stay at 10 seconds. I may actually make it longer later. And just right now I'm just making it easier to work with for now and trying to be as preemptive as possible. If this ends up being a blinking layer, the 10 seconds will be perfect for the length of the different eye positions I'll need. Alright, so I just recentered everything, and now I'm going to do the other eye. I'm just going to skip past the other eye because it's exactly the same. Okay, so the other eye is now finished, and here we go. We have two separate eyes ready to go. Just have to put them on the right side of the head. Alright, so I think what I'm going to do is actually put these eyelids in their own nested compositions so that I can have the pupil looking around and have its movements independent of the animation of the actual eyelids. I want them to sit over top of it, and I want to be able to control them with a slider outside of this composition. I'll call it ELs for eye left, eyelids. And then I'm going to sequence these layers. So right now they're all just the same length of layers. So let's make this composition a lot shorter. I'm going to bring it down to like 5 frames. And then these ones need to be 1 frame long. Great. And then I'm just going to keyframe assistant, and I'm going to sequence the layers. And this will automatically sequence the layers together. And I actually went the wrong way. So I have to select them in the opposite order and then sequence the layers again. And that will actually change the order of sequencing. Perfect. And there we go. And now I'm going to do the other guys. I'll move this over 1 because I want a blank layer for when the eyes are fully open. Okay, and keyframe assistant, sequence layers, and that should work. Let's pull it over and have a look. Yeah, okay, so that's 1 eyelid sequenced out. Okay. Let's just stretch those out. Great. Alright, so there you go, 1 working eye. So I finished both eyes, but I think what I want to do is actually extend this first frame over to the very beginning of the composition, the very beginning of the sequence, because I need something to visually reference that the eyelid is there, so I at least know everything's working. I can move that back later so that there's 1 blank frame in there. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to extend the length of these compositions that are actually housing the eye, because they need to be as long as the composition of the actual character's animation. If they're not, all the controls that I use later to move the pupils and the eyelids around will stop working as soon as the time is done in the composition here. All right, and now what I'm doing is I'm just applying a time remap effect that we'll use later, and then just extending that animation all the way to the end of the composition. So a quick thing to note with the time remap effect is that I'm actually deleting the last frame of the time remap and only keeping the first frame, and that keeps the clip at 000. This will be controlled later by a slider. I'm going to just move these eyes and roughly position them and scale them to the size I want them. I sort of want one slightly bigger than the other. Alright, it's time to add some 3D to this thing. I'm going to bring up the effects panel. It's actually missing. If you just find it, it's in your Windows panel. And I'm sliding it over and grouping it with the projects section. Okay, so the effect that we want is DigiEffects FreeForm. There it is right there. Okay, and this is the version that's actually packed with After Effects. Alright, I'm going to add a camera here. I think I'm going to set this to 54. I might change it later, but I'll probably just leave it. It's a pretty wide lens, but I think that'll work. And now it's time to do some editing. So in Freeform, there's a few ways that you can manipulate the three-dimensional shape of something. The first way, and the best way in most cases, is to actually use a grid. You can change the number of rows or columns on the grid at any point, increasing or decreasing even after you've manipulated it. So I started out this project by actually trying to use the grid, and I can just select these points here, then pull them out on the Z axis just by enabling Z only, and I can actually pull them out. So you can also manipulate these handles here to further change the curve, and I'm going to pull it up on the Y here as well, and I can use these to modify the shape even further. I'm just going to the side view here to manipulate it further and trying to get a good handle on the shape. It's good to move around all around the shape while you do this to really get a good sense of whether or not it's working. I ended up not going this route because, as you can see, the back of the shape has this bending on the edges. So I actually discarded all of the work and decided to take a different approach. And the approach I chose was to make a displacement map. And I would make a spherical displacement map by creating a gradient. Another really wonderful feature about Freeform is that you can pretty much use any layer you want as a displacement map, which means that you can also create displacement maps inside of After Effects. They don't have to be created in Photoshop. The thing you have to make sure though is if you're going to create an effect in After Effects, you need to have it in an embedded composition. You can't just have it applied to a layer solid, because Freeform won't read the effect, because Freeform won't read it as a grayscale displacement. The really cool thing about this is you could actually create any kind of displacement map you want. It could even be animated because it's referencing a layer. That can be an embedded composition, it can be an MOV file, it can be whatever you want. So what you're seeing here is that I tried to apply that solid as a displacement map with that gradient effect on it, but nothing's happening. And as I increase the displacement value, no distortion's happening. And that's because Freeform is looking at it as an orange solid, not as a gradient. The gradient is an effect on top of the orange solid. So I need to embed this orange solid into a composition. So I've put that solid into its own composition just by pressing Ctrl-Shift-C and created a new composition. And I just have to scale it now. I want it to be a perfect square. The displacement map needs to be the same ratio as the object you're applying it to. It doesn't have to be the same size. It's probably better if it's actually bigger, but it has to have the same width to height ratio if you want it to fit perfectly. So I made sure it was a perfect square because my circle is on a perfect square composition as well. So here I'm adjusting the displacement levels and it seems to be working. I'm getting a really big spike here, and that's actually because the gradient is a linear gradient. It doesn't have a really big curve. It actually goes from black to white quite evenly. So if I adjust the levels on that, I can actually manipulate how spherical it looks. Again, you can do all of this inside of After Effects. I did choose to make my displacement map in Photoshop just because I want to be using it a lot, and I'm going to use it for a lot of different objects. So it suits me well to have something in my archives to access for a spherical displacement map. Alright, so I'm just adjusting the displacement value a little bit here. I'm going to go back into Photoshop and play with the levels on this gradient. I need a more gradual curve from those whites to the darks just to create a smoother arc there, but I just flattened out my whites and I don't think that's going to work. So when I re-import this image and reload it here, there's going to be a little flat thing at the top. The reason I'm getting that flat thing is I crushed the white values down, so the right there in the center that's really hot, it's all just pure white, so it goes completely flat. So what I need to do is I actually just need to pull that middle value down a little more aggressively, and that should give me the curve I'm looking for. And there we go. That's perfect for the purposes that this puppet will be used for. So I went in and applied this displacement map to all of the other elements, the two other eyes, just by copying the FreeForm effect and pasting it on the other eyes. And now all I have to do is I have to center all of these objects in the same place. So I want them all centered because FreeForm bases its anchor point off of the layer's anchor point. So I want these guys all at the same position because these eyes have to rotate around the body. I want these eyes to rotate based on the center point of the head or the sphere that they're attached to. So here I'm just adjusting the anchor position on the z-axis to try and get those eyes to the edge. Now the way FreeForm works is it doesn't, the multiple 3D objects don't interact with each other the same way that 3D enabled layers do in After Effects. So these actually operate as layers independent of each other. So they're 3D and in the same 3D space, but they're not actually interacting based on their depth sorting. So if the left eye, for instance, is a layer above the right eye, no matter what position I put the camera at, the left eye is going to sit above the right eye. And I just have to plan for that when I'm actually animating things. So there we go. I'm lining these eyes up and I can manipulate the rotation a little bit because I want them a little higher or lower. I'm just going to keep playing with this here. It takes a little bit of experimenting to get it right. I might actually put all the positions back to 0 because I find the anchor point isn't quite working right. So I want to put all this back to 0 and I'm going to actually only manipulate the anchor point now instead of manipulating the positioning. So let's put all this to 0. And I'm going to try this again, trying to get it where I want it. And if you hold down Control, you make more subtle adjustments. They won't be so dramatic. I'm just going to adjust these eyes, go back and forth, and get them positioned properly using these rotation values and manipulating the anchor position. So I'm just going to skip ahead. Alright, so I have them mostly positioned here. I will probably be changing the position later, but I don't have to worry about it right now too much. Just want to get them roughly in the right place. Alright, so I've jumped ahead again. I added a camera here, but this camera isn't quite working. I need a camera that will always be looking at the character. It's going to be embedded in the character's composition and always filming the character's face. So I just set up a little lens here. I used a 50mm lens that usually gives you enough depth without distorting the face too badly. I don't mind some distortion though because it creates a nice curvature. Okay, so the next step here is to create a new composition. This composition is going to be where the character's main controls are all animated from. I don't want to have to deal with his eyes and all these 3D layers and a 3D camera because I want to use his character as just a little card that I can place in any world or any scene I want and move him around. So I'm created a new scene here and I've added a null object. This null object will actually drive the character's eyes and face and any controls to do with his expressions. So I've just called it point of interest and I already have an expression on this particular slider, but I'm going to add some more. Alright, so I'm going to add some angle controllers. These angle controllers will actually drive the rotation of the head in the embedded composition of the CO2 guy. So I added an X, Y, and a Z there. Probably won't be using the Z one, but I put it in anyway, just in case. So now I have to link the rotation values from the FreeForm plugin back to the composition over here that uses the expression controllers. So what I have to do is I'm just opening up those expressions controllers in the effects drop down, and I've just put the other composition beside so I can see them side by side. This way I can easily pick whip the expressions and let After Effects do all the coding for me. So I'm just alt-clicking on the rotation inside the plugin. I'm just pick whipping over to the appropriate rotation control. This is a really handy technique to limit the amount of coding that you have to do by hand. And there we go, it seems to work just fine. So now that null object in one composition is controlling the rotation values of an effect in another composition. So now I have to go in and do that to the other values here on both the eyes. But what I've just realized is that there's already a rotation value on the eyes because I actually rotated the eyes in order to make them fit to the face properly. So what I'm doing here is I just pick whipped the eye's own rotation value, and I'm adding the rotation value of the head to it. So what that's essentially doing is if my rotation value of my head is 0, but my eye is 13, and I all of a sudden rotate the head 10 degrees, well, my eye rotation will now be 23 degrees. So I went through and I did this to every part of the eye. And what you're going to see here, for both eyes I've done this. So now when I rotate the head around, the eyes actually follow. And what I'm noticing here is there's a little bit of a funny shift where the eyes are coming a little too far off the head. And I'm going to adjust that just a little bit. I'll go in and fix some of these values and tweak them a little bit so that the eyes are more what I want. You can continue to adjust things all the way through this process. In fact, I could remodel the eyes if I wanted and distort them all different ways. But I'm just going through and adjusting them and tweaking them until they suit my purposes. And I think that's looking a lot better. And that's what the Z rotation value does there, but it's really not necessary at this point. Okay, I think that's working fine. I'm never going to turn the head too far. Okay, so that seems to be working. I've just gone in and adjusted the eyes a little bit further to have them sit closer to the head. Alright, the next big step here is to get the pupils to follow that null object controller around from the root composition. So I've already pasted some code here in one of the eyes here, the pupils, and I reviewed this code earlier on in the beginning of the video, so I'm just going to go through and make all the necessary adjustments. I'm just using that same pick whip technique to obtain some of the values that I need. It's kind of hard to remember the relationship between each composition, so just by opening both of them I can pick whip and grab values that I need, and there I just grab the position value of the null object. I'm getting an error because there's another piece of code in there that can't find something it's looking for because it's from another project, and then I just pick whipped the interest slider there. So these other values I'm not going to go into too greatly. And right here, I'm just changing the value of the pupil original position to 400 and 400 because I checked to see where the pupil was in space and it was 440 or something. So I can just change the original position to 400, 400. Okay, it seems to be working. The only thing I don't like here is I'm having to move the null object a lot to get any action from the pupil. So I'm just going to change this value here. I'm just going to add a multiplier here to make the pupil travel greater distance. Okay, there we go. That's plenty. That should do it. I don't want to have to move my null object too far to make stuff happen. And the only other thing I'm not loving here is it's maybe a little too extreme. Let's try this again. Okay, and I think also the eye is a bit too far to the left. So I like this movement here, but I think I want the pupil to start a little more to the middle of the eye or more to the right side of the eye. So I'm just going to change its original position to, maybe I'll do it to 460. There we go. And I'm just changing the bit of code to correspond with that. There we go. So the eye is more where I want it. and that works perfectly. So I'm just going to jump through and apply the same exact code to the other pupil. Okay, I've done both eyes now, and they are both working really well. They're doing exactly what I'd like them to do. The code's working well. Everything seems to be functioning perfectly here. Great. Now it is time to add a blink controller. So I just duplicated the interest distance controller slider, and I just changed it to blink. So now what I want to do is I want to attach the blink slider to the time remap of the eyelids. So I'm just opening up the two compositions here so I can just do an easy, quick pick whip grab to get that value. Let's open up the controller composition. Make sure the blink is twirled down in the effects. It makes it easier to grab. Alt-click time remap and just drag that pick whip over to the value you want and select it. I just had to change here. I accidentally grabbed one of the wrong values, so I just had to make sure that that said blink because I'd accidentally grabbed interest distance. But now they're connected, and you can see that as I change that value, both eyes are opening and closing as needed. All right, the only thing that needs to be fixed now is inside the eyelids I don't have a blank frame yet, and I want the blank frame so that when the eye is fully open, it's big and buggy and there's no eyelid visible. So I'm just going to get rid of that. Okay, I've got that frame, and now the eyelids are completely open. Mission accomplished. I think the next thing I want to do is I actually want to create a left blink and a right blink because I don't always want both the eyelids to blink. I want to be able to make the character make some pretty unique imbalanced expressions. So I'm just going to change this value here from blink left to blink right. After Effects automatically updates. If you change the name of something in the project and there's expression codes linked to it, it will automatically update those linkages. Okay, so here I'm just extending the length of the composition because I want to have a number of different eyelids. Not only do I want to control each eye's blink, but I also want to control each individual eyelid sometimes. Like I might want the top eyelid up and the bottom eyelid down, or vice versa. So I'm just duplicating these layers, and I'm going to create separate sections of this timeline where the bottom eyelid and the top eyelid are independent of one another. So I'm just duplicating this up and pulling them over, and then that will give me a longer timeline and the ability to have both the upper eyelid and the bottom eyelid animated separately. Okay, there you go. As I scrub through, you can see now what all my options will be for my eyelid. Great. So let's test that out really quickly. I'm going to go back to my null object controller, and let's go to a number of different blinks here and see how it looks. Great. I'm getting all the different variations that I would like, all from 0 to 10. So all that really has to be done is the other eye has to be rigged up exactly the same. I've already gone ahead and done that, so the next step that I want to focus on is adding a displacement map to the actual eyeball itself, so that when the eyelid blinks, you can actually see there's a heavier edge to the lids as they come over the eyes, and it actually distorts the shape of the eyeball. To do this, I have to make a composition that will be my displacement map. And here I'm just duplicating the eyelid compositions and renaming them for displacement because I want the composition exactly the same size as the eyelid, and it's easy just to duplicate this. So I'm just renaming this. So now I have a left and a right, and I'm just calling them DISP for displace, and I'm going to open this up, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to delete all these embedded eyelids here. The reason I'm doing this is I need to apply some filters and effects to the actual eyelids themselves in order to make them something that the displacement map can work with. So it's easier for me to drag and drop the eyelid composition in there and add an effect to that than try to add an effect to each individual layer. So I've put that in there, and here I'm pulling in my spherical displacement map that I made in Photoshop. This could also be a spherical displacement map that you made in After Effects, doesn't really matter. Okay, so I'm putting that under, and I'm going to fit it to the eye, and then I want this displacement map to fill the whole composition, so I'm going to parent the eyelids to that sphere there and size it up. Okay, perfect. So the eyelid's moving over top of the displacement map sphere. So the next thing I need to do is turn these eyelids black and white, and I'm going to adjust the tint so that they're not so contrasty. If there's anything that's black, it will be a really severe crease in the displacement map. And I don't want my eyelids to be lower than my eyeball. I need them to sit on top of it. So what I've done here is I've just made it a screen pass layer on top of it, but I'm getting these funny edges on it, and it's because there's nothing for the layer to sit on top of. So to fix this, I'm just going to create a track matte, just using the track matte mode here, and that will keep the eyelids from coming over top of the actual shape of the sphere displacement map. And I'm going to just blur these off a little bit so the edge isn't so hard, because I don't want a really hard edge. I'd like sort of a soft edge. Okay, great. That looks pretty good. And I think it's just a little too bright. So I'm just going to adjust that value a little bit. I don't want it to start out white. I want it to add a lump to the curvature of the sphere. I don't want it to be this really dramatic thing. So I'm just making it slightly less opaque. So now all I have to do is switch the displacement map, because right now it is looking at the little sphere displacement map I made. So I'm dragging the eyelid displacement map in there. I don't need to have it visible. It can be, we don't want to have it on. And there we go. I'm just putting it onto the eye now. I've selected that layer to be my displacement map. And as you can see, I'm getting a really nice eyelid effect. The eye's not perfectly round, but I don't really mind at this point. I think it actually looks pretty great. So not only will this add a nice displacement map, but I can animate that layer. I can animate that displacement map. So I can link the displacement map to my blink slider so that when the eye blinks, the displacement map follows that blink. See, like right now it's not following. I've just closed the eye and there's that ridge is still in the same place it was before. So essentially what I need to do is enable time remapping for the displacement blink layer and have that time remap value controlled by the blink slider, just like it does for the blink on the eyes. And in fact, I'm just going to copy the blink on the eyes code and paste that onto the displacement map time remap value. And that way I don't really have to do any pick whipping or dragging to select that. So there, I'm just copying it and I'm alt clicking for the time remap value, pasting that. So now the blink displacement composition and the eyelid compositions will follow each other exactly. And as you can see, you get a really nice effect on those eyes. I think that actually worked out really great. Okay, so I've got everything linked up here, and I've added that code that I showed you earlier on with adding the rotation value based on the movement of the null object, and that's the character moving all around. The other thing that you can do with this plugin with FreeForm is actually add lights in After Effects, and it responds directly to After Effects lighting. This is actually really powerful. You can create all sorts of mood lighting if you want, or really just add a new dimension to your After Effects projects. The other thing is, FreeForm is not just for character heads or parts. It can actually be used for props or for landscapes or for walls or any parts of scenes that might need an added level of dimension. And then you can integrate them seamlessly with existing After Effects lighting. On top of that, you can change the surfaces of the objects, so you can make them more shiny, or you can make them less opaque, you can make them look a little rougher, so you can give a really nice variety of surface types as well. Here I'm just manipulating some of the surface values and just going through some of the different effects that you can get. It can be quite diverse. The other thing you can experiment with is actually creating bump maps or adding texture to your displacement maps. So instead of having a really perfect smooth sphere, you could go in and paint some little black dots or add some noise and even animate that noise like a fractal noise, and you could have the sphere rippling and bubbling around. It's actually quite endless, the possibilities, even with this limited version of the software. Okay, well I think that about wraps it up for this guy. The techniques that we looked at here can be applied to any number of different character situations, and if you're looking to do more complex or advanced 3D stuff, I would suggest looking at FreeForm Pro, since it does offer even more options and control. Alright, thanks guys.